Hey, Emilia, it's good to catch up with you now that I'm back from Buenos Aires and home in Chicago for a couple days.
Absolutely. It's wonderful to hear you.
I thought maybe we could just do a quick recap. First of all, I really appreciate you sharing about your home. Buenos Aires was an awesome stop on our trip for a couple of days. And I thought I'd tell you a little bit about what we did and get your reactions to some of it. First of all, we were staying in Recoleta at a hotel, and you didn't say it. You said Buenos Aires was a massive city, but that part of the city really reminded us of New York. It looked, it felt, the people, they had these people offering cambio everywhere. Um,
Yes, of course.
and we spent a lot of time walking around, including this 23-lane street that we had to cross to go get lunch.
I think it's considered the widest avenue in the world.
It's
Um,
crazy. And they have the
yeah.
nerve to put like a crossing signal, like you could just cross this in one change of the light. It takes like 5 minutes to walk across this street. But you mentioned how big the city was, and getting a chance to get out and walking around Recoleta right away was just a cool way to just start getting introduced. There's some amazing buildings. We went and got pizza on the first day, which I'll come back to in a minute. But you also said you were from Palermo. And we went over there and it had a very different vibe. I went over there because I wanted to do a street art tour. We couldn't do the tour, but I definitely wanted to go take some pictures of graffiti. And it turned out some of the best food we had. I had a churri there. We had actually some great vegan food, some ice cream. And you said you were from Palermo. Is the street art like a big thing there?
So I think the part of Palermo that you might be referring to is Palermo Viejo, which is a little bit more edgy, I guess. There's another side of Palermo that is closer to Avenida Libertador, which is towards the edge of the city by the river, which is more where I was from. I didn't grow so much around street art. I think that's probably newer and part
Hmm.
of the more edgy side of town. Tell me what caught your eye.
First of all, what caught my eye was it was a very different vibe. We basically took like a 5 minute Uber ride over there, and the vibe was very different. If Recoleta reminded me of like Manhattan in New York, Palermo felt like walking around a neighborhood in Brooklyn. Like it felt a little bit slower pace. There were plenty of restaurants. I think Don Julio was there, and we tried to get in there, but the first reservation they had was like 7 weeks from now. So we were like, well, I'll just show up. And we showed up and there was a massive crowd outside. And we were like, well, this isn't going to happen. But it looked like it was becoming like a hipster part of the city.
Yeah, definitely like a more edgy, up and coming,
Yep.
and a lot of like boutique clothing
Yep.
and boutique kind of like new styles of food and whatnot. Like it's fun. It's interesting that you thought Recoleta reminded you of New York. It always reminds me of Paris a little bit, like the
Yes.
architecture, the old school kind of like grand buildings and
Yes. I could totally see that.
very baroque,
But it
kind of
was the
styles.
it was more the people. It was an older city. If Santiago is like Chicago, where it felt a little bit newer, I'll say maybe a little bit less vintage, maybe cleaner might be another word for it. It felt like an older city with people that had established themselves in the neighborhood and things like that, and it just felt very familiar. And Paris actually felt the same way when we've been to Paris. The third neighborhood that we visited and spent a lot of time in was really interesting. It was La Boca, and you
Yeah.
didn't mention it, but that again, sticking with my New York, felt a little bit more like Greenwich Village, or there's parts of Chicago like Wicker Park or Logan Square where you're just like, I feel like I'm in a totally different city here.
It is a very different vibe. And yeah, maybe I neglected to mention that. I think La Boca is like, it's a very traditional side of town. It's more, I guess it's a combination of like more blue collar on one hand, and at the same time, there's an edgy crowd that like the
Hmm.
more artistic and like
Yes.
back to, the basics kind of like crowd that decided to go there.
Hmm.
It's a very unique place, right? Like the origins are like the port and the Italian immigrants built La
Yes.
Boca, right? Like
Yes.
but the colors and it does feel like a different country altogether.
What was really interesting to me was we had a couple of guides at different points in our tour for some of the day trips that we were doing. And we told them we were going to go to La Boca, and their face changed. And they were like, well, be really careful and don't leave the main strip. And if you leave the main strip, it gets very dangerous very quick. Multiple people told us that. And I got to be honest with you, I usually don't worry about that when I travel. I generally think I'm not the easiest target. At least I don't look like it. I certainly can't run anybody down, but I look like I can. And, we didn't think twice about it, and we went. And I got to be honest, everywhere in Buenos Aires, we felt totally safe the whole time. And I'm so glad that we didn't listen to sort of people who were worried. I had probably 4 or 5 people come up to me on the street throughout the city and all the neighborhoods and literally tap me on the shoulder and tell me to watch out for my camera.
Oh, really?
Like just
That is
total
interesting.
strangers. And honestly, aside from them saying that, at no point, I mean, I took pictures of strangers. We stopped in crowded places. We actually walked back from La Boca to our hotel. I mean, it took probably a couple of hours. So we walked through the neighborhoods, we walked on the street, and it was great. And I'm so glad that we got to see, I mean, it almost felt like visiting three different cities.
Yeah, I
It,
can see that. I mean, it's really heartwarming to hear that that was your experience and that you felt safe at all points in time. Like, I think that that's the Buenos Aires I grew up in was always super safe. And there
mhm.
were some bad neighborhoods that you were more careful or you avoided at night, but for the most part, you could circulate in the city at 2 in the morning as a young woman, and you wouldn't think about it twice. And then that changed dramatically, and it did become a place where you need to be a little bit more wary of street crime and
Right.
things like that. I think that's what people are reacting to. I'm very happy to hear that that was not your experience, and I'm actually headed there today. So
What?
with my two teenage daughters, it's a very walkable city, right? And that's the best way to experience it.
It totally was. And look, we're from a big city. We grew up going to cities. We went to college in different cities, so we're a little bit more streetwise. But you know, if you stayed in the areas where the restaurants and the people were, and you're never like isolated in an alley at night, which you would never do, except for when I'm shooting my street art, it takes me off the path. But even when we went to Palermo and walked in at sunset basically and into the night, it was great. And then you get to a spot, you find a place, you call an Uber, and you go back to your hotel, and you're done. There are two other things I wanted to mention as we wrap here. One, you mentioned the ice cream. We did try it. It was very good. We had good ice cream all over South America. And as somebody who can't do dairy, the sorbet and the dairy-free ice cream was awesome. But you mentioned the pizza, and I remember when you said it, I think on the podcast, I literally kind of laughed and was like, "Are you crazy?" Emilia, on the first day we went and got pizza, I had pizza every day I was in Buenos Aires. Every day.
That is unbelievable.
Every day. In fact, on the way back from Uruguay, we had to take a bus to a boat to a car to the airport. And when the boat got to Buenos Aires, we detoured and went back to a pizza place on the way to the airport to start our 12-hour trip home because the pizza was that good in Buenos Aires. You were not kidding.
It's yeah, I was not kidding. It's the Italian influence, and it's Italian with a twist, and it's a little different. It's hard to describe because
Yes.
when I say that here, they go like, "Well, but is it more like New York or like Chicago?" And you go
No,
like, "No, I mean,
neither.
it's neither, right?
It was
It's a
so good.
different thing."
And you also mentioned, again, since we don't do dairy, you mentioned the faina. And we tried that. We were there for 5 days. We tried that 4 times.
What did you think?
Everybody had a different spin on it, so they all tasted a little bit different. What was funny was when we saw it the first time, it looks like crust. It looks like if you go to a
Yeah.
store like a Whole Foods and buy like a pizza crust. So when I went into the store with my bad Spanish, I asked her what it was, and she said what it was. And I went, "Oh, so then we could put the sauce and the toppings on it?" She looked at me like, "No, you just eat it like that." And it was so good. Um,
Yeah.
and so between Pizzeria Guerin, Cuartito, Continental, we went and had pizza every single day.
That is pretty amazing. There is, of course, you're probably familiar by now with the rivalry around soccer and Boca versus Junior, Boca versus River, right? Like
Yes.
in Argentina, that's a huge thing. And then in the world of pizza, Las Cuartetas versus Guerin, like you can start a war over that.
Are those the two,
Which
like,
one's better?
did we go to the two spots that are like on
La,
opposite sides of the rivalry?
Las Cuartetas and Guerin,
Oh, man.
yes, those are two massive. They have their own massive followings, and people with down a sword of like mine is better.
Yes. Well, we went out of our way, literally on a 24-hour travel day back. We stopped for an hour at Cuartito because it was that good, and I had to do it.
Viene moviendo la calle, por las calles de San Telmo, viene moviendo la calle.
The last thing that I wanted to mention was you had said, as much as you like Buenos Aires and had a lot to share about it, you mentioned that we should get out of the city and visit an estancia. We absolutely did that. It was funny. The place that I really liked, over the course of a month, refused to respond to emails, texts, and phone calls. And the day after we went to a different one, they texted me and were like, hey, yeah, we're still doing visits. I was like, thanks. But I got to tell you, getting outside the city and into the countryside felt radically different. Like if I went back to Argentina, I would spend probably a little bit more time just getting outside of the city, because you said the vibe was different. But what I would say is the countryside came fast. I mean, we were probably in the bus for about 15 minutes and it was like, wow, we're not in the city anymore. Like we are in the countryside. The pace was slower. You know, we got there and I was still in my city mode where I was like, okay, where's food? When does the show start? What are we doing? And they were like, just sit for an hour and have some empanadas, have some water, go for a horseback ride, like just chill. And it was really cool. And then as you warned me, I don't know who they thought they were feeding. They kept bringing meat. Like they brought sausage, they brought chicken, they brought like 4 different kinds of steak. And at one point we were done. I put my napkin down and they're still coming around with more meat. It was incredible. And I'm so glad that you told me to get outside of the city and go visit an estancia, because it just gave me a different sense of life in Argentina. It was just a very different atmosphere. And I'm so glad that you recommended it.
Yeah, I mean, you know, many times the phrase that you're gonna hear people, porteños, right? Like people from Buenos Aires, they talk about the city as the cement jungle.
Mm-hmm.
And it feels a little bit like that. And as opposed to other cities that may have like, you know, a river coursing through or a mountain or some place to escape that's greener and nicer. It's like there's obviously like the river plate that surrounds the city, but for the majority of the people, they are far away from there and they're locked in a cement jungle with like a park maybe, but that's about it. So it's not uncommon for people to get out over weekends and just try and get away, right? And enjoy that slow down and just buy into that for a couple of days. And that's, I think that's very much ingrained in the lifestyle.
Well, 100% appreciate you suggesting it. I'm glad we got to experience it. Buenos Aires and Argentina were a really special part of the first leg of our travels. So thank you so much for sharing about it. I'm so glad we had a chance to go and reconnect now that we're back. And I hope you enjoy your trip down there. Sounds like later today.
We're leaving in a couple of hours, and yeah, I mean, I'm super excited. I haven't been in a while. My girls have not been in a while, so we can't wait. You know, it's a joy to share my heritage with my kids right now that they're a little older and can absorb more. So I can't wait.
Hello, listeners, and welcome back to another amazing episode of My Home is Special. I'm Taylor. I'm sure you're getting used to my voice by now, and you're excited to hear some of the questions I'm going to be asking Keith as we dig into the beautiful Argentina. Are you ready, Keith?
I'm ready. Let's do it.
Let's do it. So I know you got to visit Buenos Aires, and I'm really excited to kind of hear about your experience in that city. I've heard so much about it, and I'm really excited to meet someone and know someone who's visited it. So I guess my first question is, did you feel like you kind of fit into the city? Like, could you see yourself living there ever? Or could you see yourself, I know you say you don't go back to places twice, but could you really see yourself immersing there if you had more time?
You know, it was interesting because I had heard so much about Buenos Aires growing up, and, you know, there were all these shows about Argentina, and Evita was on Broadway for like most of my childhood, it seemed like. So there were always these commercials, and that's all I knew about it was like, I'm not supposed to cry for Evita, whoever she was. So we finally got down there, and I got a chance to talk with Emilia before and after, as people just heard, about Argentina. And I would say it reminded me a lot of New York. And I like to visit New York, but I wouldn't want to live in New York. And I spent the summer working in New York. But when I talked with Emilia, she talked about it reminding her a little bit of New York, or like Paris. Maybe I would throw London in the mix. But it was a big city. And I think big cities have their own personality, and people sort of find the city that feels like it's a good fit for them. And I could totally see how people would go to Buenos Aires and just fall in love with it and never leave. It felt like one of those cities to me. You know, it was huge. It had all the things, both good and bad, people everywhere, public transit. It had the widest road, I think, in the world. It's like 23 lanes. So crossing the street from our hotel took like a good 10 minutes. And, you know, our tours, we got to see the sights. They had Messi and Ronaldo everywhere. You know, just the murals and the pride that they have in him. Sadly, our first impression of the city was the walking tour that we did, which was literally the hottest day we were in the country. So it settled down after that and we enjoyed it. But when it got off to a bit of a rocky start,
Wow, that sounds like a lot of calories burned.
it definitely was. So we made up for it with ice cream and pizza.
Was it good? Was the pizza the best part of the food there, or did you have something else?
I'm telling everybody who will hear me, I had pizza every day that I was in Argentina. It was as good as Emilia said, and I thanked her for it when we chatted again.
Okay, I want to dig into the cultural component because I feel like it's a special component that we have in each episode. I would love to dig into, was there a part of the culture that you connected to immediately or really just connected with in any way?
Emilia didn't really mention it, but we got advice when we got there that we should go see tango. I think somebody might have mentioned it in one of the other countries that we were in. And honestly, if you have any remote interest, you can't avoid it. It's like walking through Times Square in New York where like everybody is pushing a tango show. And you're like, are they all the same show? Like, what are y'all doing? How many tango shows do y'all have here? And so we went the first full day we were there. We went to a dinner show. I got advice from our hotel on which show to go to, which may or may not have been a good idea. But in a world where there's like everybody on the street is pushing different shows, I was like, let me go to one that's at least recommended by somebody I trust. And the staff at the hotel was fantastic. We did it backwards, though. We saw the show first, and it was great. It was like being in Ireland and seeing sort of the Irish dance where you just feel like, okay, I'm seeing something that's important. It's set up for the tourists because it's clearly a dinner theater, but it's important, and it's important to appreciate and experience it while you're here. But we saw the show, and then later in our trip, we got to see the origin of tango, which I thought was really interesting.
And where does that origin kind of live for those of us that never really learned the history of tango?
So I wouldn't say I'm an expert in the history of it, but we went to a neighborhood called La Boca, which is at the mouth of the river in Argentina. And our guide there was an American who had a master's in like Latin American history or something and had moved down there and was doing these free walking tours, which meant the price was right. And he gave us a lot of the history of the city, of that particular neighborhood. And then he got into tango. And I thought it was really interesting that it started in a poor part of the city where the porteños, lived. And those were the people that were working in the port. So it was a lot of immigrants, a lot of people that I'm guessing were lower on the socioeconomic spectrum. And tango was something that evolved in the brothels and the bars in that community, and that it was actually performed by two men dancing together at first. And the upper class in Argentina didn't like tango because of those origins, sort of in the lower economic neighborhoods in the city. And as I'm hearing this, I just kept thinking about hip hop and how people would sort of look down their nose at it. And now it's everywhere. It's in everything. It's in commercials. It's in the Super Bowl, at the halftime show. It's, you hear it in restaurants. You're watching TV, and as they go to commercial break during the NBA, they're playing hip hop. And, now it is what it is. But when it first came out, it was sort of looked down upon something that those city people do. And tango had a little bit of those same origins. It was not the cheapest ticket to go see a show, but he was explaining to me that those are for the tourists and that there are venues where people go to actually dance tango, not just watch it. And if you want to get out into the neighborhoods, you can really experience it the way the locals do, because many of them can't afford to go to the shows the tourists go to. We didn't make it to one of those spots, but that is definitely something I would do if I had a chance to go back.
Okay. And is there any plans in your future to learn tango, Keith?
I like to say that I'm breaking down stereotypes here, Taylor. I can't sing. I can't dance. I just, I take photos.
Okay. And you know what? You take them well.
Thank you.
So from my little bit of knowledge, I know Argentina to be kind of economically advanced when it comes to some of those Latin American countries. What did you see? Like, did you see that out there? Did you see some of that in the differences between some of the other countries? Just overall, did it feel did it feel more, I guess, American influenced in that sense, or like more of an economically advanced country?
I wouldn't say that I experienced that. To me, it definitely felt more European in some ways. Like I mentioned New York, but I also mentioned Paris or London. It had that kind of a feel to it, an older city with all the things. So I wouldn't say that I felt that way about it. But Emilia described the need for me to go see a ranch and spend a day outside the city, the estancia. And she talked about it as, there's not a river in Buenos Aires. There's not a real waterfront necessarily. So people that live in the city are kind of landlocked in the concrete jungle, I think she called it. So they, a lot of times, would sort of take the weekends or holidays and get out into the countryside. And we went to one that was nice enough and a good enough experience to see what the culture was like. But when I was looking online for places, Taylor, I saw estancias that had frankly, almost like castles on the property. And I can only imagine that those were some of the estates that go back quite a ways. They're now estancias and you can go and have lunch or stay in them like a bed and breakfast. But that was probably the glimpse that I saw where I'd say, oh, it's not just the city here. There's like a whole nother countryside that I'm not experiencing until we finally did it and got out there for a day.
Wow. And if you can you talk about a little bit of your experience just in the personal of the estancia?
Yeah, so what was interesting for me was, one, we were with a great group of people, so that was fun because it wasn't a private tour. We were on a bus and there were going to be other buses there. The drive was interesting. It was a little bit like Chicago. So in the first part of the drive, we drove away from the part of Buenos Aires that we had been in, and I started to see, for lack of a better way to say it, I would say lower income housing. It reminded me of seeing the favelas in Brazil or some of the townships that I've seen in South Africa. And it was very clear that you were in a different part of the city, and it wasn't a part of the city that you would visit if you were just on your own walking around. And we didn't stop. We just drove through it, but it gave me a sense of how big the city was. I mean, we drove for a little while and we were still clearly in the city. But then my reference to Chicago is that it was almost like a light switch happened, and all of a sudden you look around and there's just like nothing. It's like the plains and the farms and you're outside the city. And it's like that if you drive south in Chicago, 30 minutes, you're very quickly in farmland. It's like, what just happened? Where did I make a wrong turn somewhere? And it was just like that in Buenos Aires. And so we drove all the way out. We stopped at a small town, and the pace was totally different than Buenos Aires. It was just it wasn't a village. It was a small town, but it was quiet. It was like going to a small suburban town square. And we stopped, did a couple things, stopped in a museum, talked with a few people. And then we got to the ranch, and, we had seen the gauchos in Chile. In Patagonia, we spent a lunch at the ranch, but it wasn't the, traditional Argentinian gaucho estancia culture. And when we got there, it was interesting because I was ready to do my thing. I'm a photographer. I'm like, okay, when's the show? When do we eat this meat that I keep hearing about? And we just sat for an hour or an hour and a half. And they gave us empanadas, and they were like, just enjoy the day. And it was exactly what Emilia said now that I'm thinking about it. But at the time, I was like, all right, let's get this show on the road. We're all here. And we hung out for an hour. We took a horseback ride for about 45 minutes. And then they served lunch. And Taylor, they just kept bringing meat. It was like sausage, and it was chicken, and it was steak, and it was more steak, and then it was more steak. And then I was done. And then they came around with more steak. And I was like, what is happening here? And then I got it. I was like, oh, they're not in a rush. We're just going to eat. And we're going to eat until it's time to go. And that was really cool. And we got to see a little bit of a show while we were there too.
I love also just the connection immediately that I felt like you had there, but also the differences. They're so stark, but also they're not stark enough where you feel like you're in a different place, but you kind of can still remember where you're at. I think that's beautiful. Wow.
What was neat was you had that connection, and when you settle in, they had lunch, and then they had some performers. And, as a photographer, I'm like, game time. And there was a band, and there was a couple that was dancing. And what stood out to me was just, they seemed to be enjoying themselves so much. And it was an older gentleman and another woman, and they were dancing. And the smile on their face and the grace and the respect that they showed as they were going through the dance was just you could just feel it. And afterwards, because I am who I am, I went over and started talking to everybody so I can get their Instagrams and get them their photos. And it turns out they were a family. And, it was a woman playing in the band with her boyfriend and one of their friends. And the little kid that was dancing alongside them was the grandson. And the couple that looked like they were 100% into each other, whether we were there or not, I thought they might be dancing, were husband and wife. And they were the matriarch and patriarch of the family. And we got a chance to sort of experience the culture, the song and the dance and the music. But it was also more like a family gathering that we just had a chance to observe as outsiders. And it was just really awesome for us.
That connects to me immediately because listening to Emilia's segment in the previous podcast, you heard her kind of speak a little bit on that. So that's really cool to hear that you experienced that in your own way.
100%.
Well, I gotta end it with, I think, my favorite part at this point that every listener knows, and hopefully it's theirs as well. What is the story that you're gonna take and that you're gonna tell?
Taylor, I didn't think I had a story from Argentina. And I realized, like, oh, it's because I'm trying to block it out of my memory. And so we had heard about La Boca from somebody who said it was a really neat place. And then I found it in my tour book. And it's like this, there's a street called El Caminito. And it's this colorful street where the buildings are all painted in different colors and there's different art. And it became sort of like the arts district for the city. And I like to think of it like Shoreditch in London, where there's graffiti everywhere. And there's parts of Chicago where there's just a lot of graffiti and street art. And so I had in my head that we were going to go to La Boca and see El Caminito. And we mentioned it to the guide who was taking us to the ranch. And his face just changed. And he went, oh, it's really dangerous over there. Like, you're okay in the Caminito, but don't walk in the outskirts of it. You know, stay there and don't go anywhere else. And then I was reading my book and I realized that that's where a lot of the immigrants came and a lot of the new people to Buenos Aires came. And so in my mind, I'm thinking, oh, I get it. This is the black part of the city and everybody's afraid of it. Because other people were telling us, like, be careful there. And I'm like, oh, here we go. You know, I have friends that are afraid to come to the south side of Chicago to see Obama's house because it's on the south side. And I'm like, it's right next, it's like 2 blocks over. Like, I don't, like, what are you talking about? Like, get over yourself. So we decided to go. And I pinned it in Google Maps like I do all of the destinations when I travel because I download the maps so I can find my way around. And it's called El Caminito. And the next morning, without really paying attention, I have a pretty good sense of direction. I called an Uber and I put in El Caminito and I wanted to find a coffee shop because one of the things Emilia said was post up at a coffee shop and just enjoy the morning air and just be. And so I found El Caminito and then I searched in the area and there was a coffee shop nearby. So the next morning I put that coffee shop in, called an Uber, and he started going towards La Boca. And then he made a right turn and I was like, that's weird. But I put it in Uber. So we get to this coffee shop and we're in like a residential neighborhood. We're not like in a touristy part. I don't see any colorful buildings. I'm like, what is going on here? It didn't look anything like what I expected. So I said, hey, Tosh, before we order coffee, let's just go walk over to El Caminito so we can see El Caminito de Colores. Colorful little street, I suppose is the translation or something like that. So we walk 2 blocks from the coffee shop over there and we don't see any colorful buildings. It's like, I mean, the equivalent of like passing by a dental office, you know, like it's like nothing. Like you're just like, what is this place? And then it hits me. I look up and we're in front of a daycare and there's all these little kids screaming inside. And the name of the daycare is El Caminito de Colores. And it's not the street that I was looking for. And I'm not anywhere near where we could walk to where we were going. But they literally named this daycare the same thing as a tourist attraction, which to me needs to be changed. It's totally ridiculous that they did that, and I'm still very upset about it. Tasha just looked at me and just shook her head and laughed because Taylor, we were a good 20 minutes out of the way in the wrong direction. So after a pretty good laugh, I took my ribbing. We went back to the coffee shop, had some great coffee, enjoyed the company of the people that were inside, sat outside on the sidewalk, and when the coffee was done, they gave us the Wi-Fi. And we took another Uber all the way to La Boca and the Caminito that I intended to. I will say this, despite all the warnings, we walked back to our hotel, which was 3 or 4 miles away, and took the better part of an afternoon. And it was an absolutely wonderful walk. And all of the concerns that people had were totally unfounded. But my complaint remains, they should not name a daycare the same as a tourist attraction if it's nowhere near the tourist attraction.
I think that is my favorite story you've told yet, and I'm pretty sure that's going to top any story that you tell after.
It's not my finest moment as the tour operator for my family.
I was going to say, you talked about incompetent tour operators.
It's not my profession, so I will stand by that, Taylor.
Thank you so much for sharing, Keith. I'm, as usual, excited for our next episode. I think we have, 2 more left? And then
Indeed.
Go with you for the next leg of your tour. I'm very excited for this.
Thanks, Taylor. Great talking with you. Thanks for listening to this episode of My Home is Special. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast so you get future episodes automatically. Go to myhomeisspecial.com for the occasional email update too. That's where links to photo galleries and a few other surprises will live. Be sure to follow KBev Photo on Instagram for behind-the-scenes footage during our journey, and it'll be in the stories. If you just want the photos, go to kbevphoto.com. There's a lot else on there to explore. For now, this is Keith, aka KBev, signing off. Peace.